That's my mirror tonight.
You look good there.
Yeah.
But it is so, so good to be here. I am sick and tired of COVID. How about y'all?
Amen.
So it is so good to be able to be back in person and doing this. It's been far too long. And so I'm going to just tell you real quick because I've already had questions about it. This is the first time I've actually been able to do an Aunt Jenny program and, well, since the beginning of COVID until March 20th, the first day of spring, and we finally did the dedication for the Aunt Jenny Monument. And it is beautiful. I'm so proud of it. I'm beyond proud of it. It's a project that was long, long overdue for me. And up here on this table is a little bit of information. Well, I mean, not information, it's pictures from the monument, what the plaque says on the front of it, and then this cool picture here. I'm going to hold this up, and you all are welcome to come up and look at these. But
Where's it located?
it's at the Pebble Community Center on the outskirts of Haleville. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Pebble community.
No.
But the Pebble community is actually Aunt Jenny's stomping ground, and we originally were going to put this over at the Houston jail, where we've placed several other Winston County monuments, people that were pertinent to Winston County. The only reason I really ever consented to put her over there originally was because we did Alabama History Day there every year, and I was usually Aunt Jenny for all the fourth graders in Winston County. But that all has changed as well, and I said it was God's time and not mine. He knew what was coming down the road, and I didn't. And so if that had all stopped, she'd have just been way over there out of her territory. So I had always thought about putting her at the Pebble Community Center. Myself and my family maintained that area. It was the site of the old Pebble Schoolhouse. But ironically, the road in front of the Pebble Community Center is part of the old Byler Road. And the old Byler Road, of course, is the same Byler Road that ran in front of Aunt Jenny's home place out in the Bankhead. So Aunt Jenny would have traveled that road, and it's only about maybe 4 or 5 miles. To put it into perspective, it is close enough that several years ago, as a fundraiser for the monument, we started at the community center, and they showed a short film, documentary on Aunt Jenny in our big building there, had the kitchen running full-fledged, and then we had 2 trailers running hay rides coming to me and my crew out in the Bankhead at Poplar Springs Cemetery where Aunt Jenny resides. And yes, I said resides, not rest. So we did phenomenally well that night. To say that we were all in shock is an understatement. I had told everyone she's the legend, not me, and I said if we do this, people will come. Needless to say, they were turning people away at around midnight. Me and my crew were waiting on the last hayride at 2 o'clock in the morning. Yes. So that area obviously is Aunt Jenny's stomping ground. It's close enough. She would have traveled that route. And so I am just so excited that she's there at the community center. But this, and I know most of you back there can't see it. Again, when we get done, you can come up and look. This strange looking stone with these fossilized flowers was Aunt Jenny's original headstone. I have had it in my possession for several years, and there is a story with it. A lady that lived in Haleville, she was neighbors to a Mr. Christopher who worked for Haleville Marble Works for 40 years. He was responsible for placing Aunt Jenny's first granite or marble headstone and removing this one. And so he took it home with him. And Miss Betty Ward, who was his neighbor, had observed this and commented on it and told him that if he ever got rid of it, she wanted it because Aunt Jenny had delivered her father. And so she had a special connection to it. So years down the road, he did just that. He passed it off to Miss Betty and her husband. And then as she and her husband, Waylon, began to age, they took it to a friend of mine, Mr. Turner, that used to do programs with me and a lot of historical projects. And he come wagging that thing into the Haverhill Library where I work with a grin from here to Texas saying, "You're not going to believe what I have." And no, I would have never guessed what he had. So I have had that for all this time with the understanding that when we finally built this monument, that it would be placed on this base under the plaque with all of our information on it. And that's exactly what we done. So I know, again, y'all can't see way in the back, but
Can you pass that around?
we can.
It's not.
Yes, just pass it around.
Are you related to her?
I am not, well, that I have definitively found, I have not. I definitely feel related, and everybody else called her Aunt Jenny, of course, but I am not. But I have had the distinct pleasure of meeting many of her descendants. And the day of the dedication, we had, goodness, I don't know how many descendants were there, from Florida, all over Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, Kentucky. So it was a good day. We probably had 200 to 250 in attendance that day. And so it is another project completed and done, and her history can live on for a long time. So with that being said, I know I see a lot of familiar faces that were here a couple of years ago when I was here to visit you all. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Aunt Jenny, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the stuff that she done. So for those of you who do not know, Aunt Jenny, as I always say, she was just like you or I. She met her husband Willis Brooks, and of course back then they married very young. And he was 20 years her senior, but that didn't matter either back then, it didn't seem. And they got married, moved into what was then known as the Black Warrior Mountains, which is now the Bankhead National Forest. Settled in on about 120 acres and began to farm, and I believe they ran like a roadhouse, like a bed and breakfast inn, and he was a boot and saddle maker, and they were living a life just like anyone else. They had 9 living children. One had died in childbirth, I believe, or soon after. But she and Willis had those 9 children, and all was well until the Civil War came along. And like many other folks, everything changed then. But for Aunt Jenny, her story goes during the Civil War and well beyond. They, whether it was the Union or Confederate, and I believe it was both sides, but it seems that the Confederate Home Guards had came in, and they had been after, obviously, her husband Willis and her oldest son John to join up. Willis had already fought in a war, and he didn't want any part of it. But I don't believe that would have mattered whether he had already fought a war or not, because so many of the hill country folk, obviously what y'all do, you know history. Most folks in this area and in the hills, they didn't want to join that war. They simply wanted to be left alone, remain neutral. But unfortunately, those that had joined up, and especially those home guards, they felt like you either join up or either you're an enemy. So as this progressed along, one of the stories says that it could have been over money, it could have been over other things, but the main story that seems to be told is that there was a skirmish that took place along the old Byler Road, down in a rut in the road, and that day there were a few Union soldiers obviously killed and left laying. Now, these home guards are said to have looked upon that and said to the Brooks family, "You leave them laying. You let the varmints and the vultures have them. They don't deserve a decent burial." But now I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, whether those men had been your best friend, a family member, or your absolutely worst enemy in the world, would you have done that? Would you have just left them?
No.
Especially if they were either on or very near your property, right? I don't think any of us would, and neither did they. And one of the stories says that obviously they buried these men, and after that, the Confederate says, then if you're not for us, you must be against us. They came in and brutally tortured and killed her husband and her oldest son. And that is truly the beginning of the legend of Aunt Jenny. Aunt Jenny was born Louisa Elizabeth Jane Bates in January 1826 in Kentucky. And again, everything was just hunky-dory until that terrible war come along. But after they did this terrible deed to her family, it is said that she swore vengeance upon those men. She took her sons and she made them lay their hands upon those bodies, it is said, and made them swear that every man that was involved would pay with their lives for what they had done. Now that sounds awful, doesn't it? And a lot of these stories that I'm going to tell you are where Aunt Jenny's legend comes alive, and people add to and they misconstrue who she was, her character. But what I stress to everyone that I present a program to is that you have to understand this was in the middle of the Civil War. In the middle of the 1800s, she could not pick up the phone and call 911. She couldn't even pick up the phone and just call down the road and say, I need some help up here, right? It was the times that she was a victim of, along with so many other ones in that area and all over this country of ours. But unfortunately, that vengeance that Aunt Jenny set out upon those men would cost her way more than she ever bargained for. If that was the only loss she had ever had, her story wouldn't seem so bad. But by the time Aunt Jenny died at the age of 98, all 10 of her children were gone but one. All 5 sons more than likely died by some type of gun wound. We know that 4 of them did, and 1 disappeared on an Oklahoma gun trail after he had been involved in a shootout with some fellas that they had followed all the way to Oklahoma that were supposedly involved with that terrible deed to their father. Aunt Jenny could have never bargained what it would all cost her. Yet, in the end, as much as she had lost, and all of those stories of how vengeful she could be and how protective of her family she could be, after all, by then, Aunt Jenny had gained the reputation of she said what she meant, and she did what she meant. But she still loved people. I do not know how she maintained her character and her love for humanity, I guess you could say, after all of that kind of loss, the grief, everything that had happened to her. Because it is said that even after those soldiers killed her husband and her son, there was some that came back and tried to burn out everything she had. I believe the other side is accused of doing a terrible deed or attempting to do a terrible deed to her daughter. Many of her descendants tell me that's where the legend of the skull for a soap bowl comes in. You have some that dispute that, but some of her descendants swear to it that she had it, that it belonged to that of a man who had tried to do another terrible deed, and she used him as an example. A lot of these things sound horrible, including a story that my pastor had told me about some soldiers that came in and told her they were there to take her horses. Now, let's think about that. You're in the middle of the Civil War. These soldiers ride in, you have your children, the remaining children, you're a widow, in the middle of that wilderness out there, and they say, I'm taking your horses. You do have options, but not many. Because as I say, you could have said, no, you're not taking my horses. And then what would have happened?
They took them anyway.
And probably the rest of their lives. They would have probably all died. So a lot of people say, well, why in the world didn't she just let them have them? Well, she could.
Had to have something to make a living with.
She had to have something to make a living with. She had to have something for transportation down out of that, up in the mountains. But I like to think it wasn't just a selfish reason either. Aunt Jenny was a medicine woman and a midwife. Now how's she going to travel to assist anyone else if her horses were all gone? So she had to be smart and she had to be quick. And so she said, well, if that's what you got to do, fellas, I guess that's what you got to do. But you know what? I bet it's been a while since you've had that belly of yours full of anything hot to eat. So why don't you all just sit down right there and I'll serve you up some grub. And she did. They didn't take her horses. Now I always get asked, what did she feed them? I can think of several things if she was a medicine woman. Being an herbalist, most people assume, and so do I, probably a mushroom. I mean, that's, you know, some of the mushrooms are the deadliest, the quickest. Some people say, well, poisonous sumac and other things, but I don't suppose we'll ever know. But what we do know is that she was smart and she was quick. And no, that was not just a horrible act that Aunt Jenny set out to do, now was it? It was a matter of what?
Survival.
Survival. Thank you all very much. That's exactly what she was doing. She was not just thinking, no, you're not taking my horses. She was thinking about survival for her, her family, her neighbors, and friends. And that's what she did. So there are some very interesting stories like that about Aunt Jenny. But then as time goes on, there are those that really show you her character. Because as I said, her being a medicine woman and a midwife, Aunt Jenny is said to have delivered probably more babies than anyone ever did in that Bankhead Forest. It's also assumed that she never really charged. Now that didn't mean she didn't barter and trade. But everything I've ever heard, she didn't actually charge for a delivery. Now, you know, again, some things through history get lost. But being a medicine woman, there's so many stories that's told about Aunt Jenny. When someone was sick and ailing, they'd send for Aunt Jenny. She'd go to a neighbor's house and she'd stay as long as she needed to try to assist them and aid them in getting them back to health to where they were back on their feet. But after Aunt Jenny had lost so much, she did gain that reputation of being that woman you don't mess with her family. She was quoted in a 1920s Birmingham newspaper saying that she was proud of all of her boys. They died like men with their boots on. Well, she ought to be proud of them, because from what I hear and have been told, after her husband died, and then even after she married her second husband, Jacob Strouder Johnston, it is she who taught her boys how to shoot. Some of those boys would end up running with the Hughes and Jennings gang, the Bill Doolin gang. It's also said that if you've ever heard of Little Dick West, have any of you ever heard of him? He was known as a gunslinger. He became known as Little Dick West. He was an orphan. But he gained his name and reputation under the tutelage of the Brooks boys. So now let's fast forward. Aunt Jenny lost, and she lost, and she lost. But she also had grandchildren, son-in-laws, and daughter-in-laws. So she raised even some of her grandchildren, it is said, because like Donna, her daughter that was the postmaster over there, I think she died young. But either way, one of her grandsons was in her yard playing, carrying on. A traveling salesman comes along, riding down the road. He rides into the Brooks family's yard and he tells that young man, he said, "Young man, tell you what, if you'll go fetch me and this here horse of mine some water, I'll give you a dime." Now that sounds like an awful lot of money. Now, most of you in here are old enough to understand why that would have been so exciting for that young man. But when I'm talking to school students, I have to explain to them why that little fella, he broke into a run and he took off. And he went to the well and he drawed up a bucket of water. He came back and the man and his horse took him a long, cool drink. But then that man just climbed up on his horse and he rode on down the road. Well, that young man was terribly upset and he went and told Aunt Jenny what had happened, what the man said. She said, "Well, that's all right. You go on about your chores. I'm going to go take a ride and I'll be back shortly." And they said she went in the house and she got that old breech-loaded shotgun. She saddled up and down the road she went. A few miles down the road, she caught up with him. Now, again, some of you ladies in here are old enough to understand that women's rights and their mouths haven't always been accepted, have they? And so it is said that that salesman had a few words for Aunt Jenny when she approached him and said, "Did you or did you not tell my grandson you'd give him a dime if he'd fetch you and that there horse of yours some water?" "Yeah, so?" "Well, that's what you said and that's what you're going to do." It is said they had quite a heated exchange and he didn't appreciate Aunt Jenny's sass. But after a bit, he finally told her, he said, "Here, you take him the dime." She says, "No, sir.
You take it.
You're the one that said you would give him the dime, and that's what you're going to do." He had a few more words to say. But about the time that shotgun came up between his shoulder blades, they say he had a change of mind. And she followed him all the way back to the Brooks family farm, made him give that young man that dime, and they weren't ever bothered by him again. Now, understand, I didn't say she did any harm to him. I'm sure she didn't have to, because I'm sure she about scared him half to death. But that was just where Aunt Jenny had gotten to the point of, that you're not going to harm my family, you're not going to do that, you're going to keep your word. And then we go even further. Aunt Jenny, being of Cherokee blood also, her heritage and I believe the times, it didn't ever seem to matter to Aunt Jenny about color or race. And Aunt Jenny is credited with delivering many of those Hubbard babies. Are most of you familiar with the Hubbards? Barb is. If you're not familiar with the Hubbards, you really can't tell Aunt Jenny's story without talking about them. As a matter of fact, Lawson Hubbard has as many stories and legends told about him almost as Aunt Jenny does. But the Hubbards were descendants or slaves of Major David Hubbard. Major David Hubbard was our Indian Affairs Commissioner for the state of Alabama at that time. And these slaves, even after the war, stayed up in the mountains. They stayed there, and of course they obviously took on the Hubbard name. Their wives, well, William and Jency Hubbard, then they had Lawson and their children, and the other one, Aunt Jenny delivered many of those children. They grew up with her children. They were friends. You know, the color and the race just didn't matter. Until Henry Hubbard accused Henry Brooks, Aunt Jenny's baby boy, of stealing a horse. Now, what is the punishment for stealing a horse?
Hanging.
Hanging. Still got to look this up. Maybe some of you can look it up, because it's my understanding that it's actually still on the law books today that stealing a horse is punishable by hanging. But either way, obviously they knew that Henry could be hung for this. Now, I did not know until just recently, and I'm going to tell you this story and how all this came about too, but I did not know and had never been told that the Hubbards actually raised very fine horses, some expensive horses. Henry Brooks was known to have an eye for fine horse flesh. So, on this particular day, in April of 1884, Gainham, Aunt Jenny's son, and a Deputy Phillips, along with other ones, showed up at the Hubbard home. And Henry Hubbard said it was either shoot or be shot. Because Aunt Jenny's son, Gainham, was known to be a sharpshooter. And so Henry Hubbard knew that if Gainham got a shot off, that he would kill him. And so instead, it was Henry Hubbard who shot Gainham and killed him. Aunt Jenny's son-in-law, Sam Baker, shot and killed the Deputy Phillips. It was a terrible day. And from then on, everything changed between the Brooks and the Hubbards. Because it is said that when Aunt Jenny came on the scene that day, that she went down over Gainham's body, and as she came back up, she had his gun, and she pointed it at Henry Hubbard. And she said, "For every one of mine you've took, I'm taking 10 of yours." Now, you remember, that's 20 years after the Civil War. Aunt Jenny had gained that reputation of, what did I say? She said what she meant what she said. It is said that night that the Hubbards packed up everything they light of the moon, left the mountains, and went down into the valley in Lawrence County, and never returned up in there because they feared for their lives, because they took her at her word. So now let's fast forward. Way forward. I received a phone call from a lady. Let's see, this has been about 5 years ago. Her name was Fran Bush. She started asking me if it would be possible if her and some of her family could come and interview me about Aunt Jenny. And she proceeded to tell me who she was and why. And she was a direct descendant of those Hubbards. She wanted to know if I felt that after all this time there was still animosity. And even if I thought that maybe some of the Brooks family would join them for the Hubbard family reunion. I said, I think I can round up some. And so after asking me could they come and interview me, I even laughed and I said, well, what I want to know is if I can crash your party. She said, well, I was hoping you would come and speak. It is since then that she and I have become such good friends. They're amazing people. She has diligently done her homework. And I love it when this side and this side have had the stories handed down. And then you say, what were you told? Tell me your story. And this side are the same. That's what we call history, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And that is why we all should pass down our stories, our heritage, our legends, the family history, the good, the bad, the ugly. Because somewhere back through your history, there's going to be some ugly, but it's what makes us who we are. So after all of that, yes, they had a 4-day reunion. And there were several of the Brooks family that showed up. It was just amazing. And then, when we did the dedication for Aunt Jenny, I called and asked for a repayment of that favor and asked would she come and speak. Boy, did she ever. She knocked my socks off. And I had no knowledge, prior knowledge, before she spoke as to what she was going to do. And she was in her, and I don't have a picture of her, but she was in her full Creek Muskogee regalia, beautiful as ever. And she began to tell who she was. And just even now, she was saying that some families said, you should go do this. Others said, no, you shouldn't go. And she said, but the ancestors told me, go. So I want to share with you all something that she presented. And again, to me, this goes to show our history, okay? And where history can take us if we allow it. This is a proclamation of the Hubbard and the Brooks family truce, March 20th, 2022. Whereas William and Jency Hubbard and Louisa Elizabeth Jane Bates Brooks Johnston, with descendants domiciled worldwide, are major characters in one of Alabama's most significant legends, which is ingrained in the heritage, hearts, and minds of its communities and families. And whereas on April 12th of 1884, there was a deadly encounter in Kinloch, Alabama, between the Hubbard and the Brooks families, where my third great uncle, Henry Hubbard, shot and killed Gaynham Brooks in self-defense, and Deputy York Phillips was shot and killed by Sam Baker. And whereas Hubbard and Brooks descendants have not forgotten this day, and although there have been no known incidents since, it is time for a truce in the hearts and in the minds of both families. And therefore do I, Frances Olivia Bushell, a Hubbard family historian of the Creek Muskogee family of nations domiciled in Trinity, Alabama Republic, urge all descendants and citizens to honor this Hubbard and Brooks proclamation of truce, as we are for love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. She's done it completely official, and this will be filed in Montgomery. Isn't that amazing? All of these years later. So this is going to be laying up here if you all want to look at it. Now, I want to tell you a couple of more little stories about Aunt Jenny. And those of you, some of you I know you've heard, but there's a lot of you I don't recognize faces, so I have to share a couple of these with you. Way on up, when Henry began to grow up, Henry had already been in a gunfight chasing after these men and had his leg blowed off up in Oklahoma, and he came back and even was a lawman for a while. But he said the only honest way he could make a living was making moonshine. And so, because of his extracurricular activities, he was very leery and skeptical of who came snooping around, especially by the light of the moon. And Henry had fixed him a homemade security system. He had tied a string to a cowbell and had ran it out across the old roadbed out of his bedroom window, out across that roadbed in the yard. And that way, if anybody comes snooping around, they'd trip over that cowbell, and of course, lang-a-lang-a-lang-a-lang-a-lang. And they said Henry would jump up out of that bed, and he'd grab the shotgun, he'd point it out the window, and he'd shoot and ask questions later. Well, this particular young man, that his descendant passed this story on to me. He said his grandfather used to stay with Henry and Aunt Jenny quite often. And he would obviously stay in the room with Henry. And on one said night, that cowbell started ringing. Henry jumps up out of the bed and does just that. He points it out the window and he shoots in the direction. He just laid down and went back to sleep like nothing had ever happened. But as I tell everyone, I got a feeling around sunup the next morning, it was not quiet on the Brooks family farm. Some of you that have not heard that story, I want you to guess and tell me what it was that Henry had shot.
The sheriff?
The uncle? The uncle?
Yeah.
The uncle or
Horse, cow.
Cow.
the cow itself?
He had shot Aunt Jenny's milk cow. This gentleman is laughing because you know the gravity of that, don't you? Young folks have a hard time understanding when I tell them that story why it was such a big deal.
That was the milk.
They didn't have no milk for breakfast.
Oh, it was worse than that. You know it was. She probably depended on that cow for at least one calf a year. You know, not just milk, but butter. Oh my goodness. And you know, that was hard times back then. Replacing that would not have been easy. I usually tell young boys and girls, I say, think of it as blowing up mom or dad's car. That's what it would have been like. And I have a feeling that until he was, God rest his soul, he was killed at his whiskey still by a posse. I'm sure Henry never lived that down. Rightfully so. Now, there's one other story that everyone loves to hear about Aunt Jenny, because she was quite a character, and even though she has all these other stories, I don't know, it's just, you know, I tell everybody there's no need to tell all the garbage, because her life reads like a novel. But Aunt Jenny was known to go down into Lawrence County, down into the valley, to shop at the old general store, the mercantile. And when she would go in, she would often go up to the counter to pay for her goods, and she would reach down in her skirt tail, or pull her skirt tail up and reach down inside her stocking and pull out a wad of money. This young dude over to the side, he had observed this on more occasions than not. And the curiosity just absolutely got the best of him. And so one day, he walked up and he said, Aunt Jenny, I just have to know, how is it you always have money? And she said, young man, it's real easy. I pay myself $20 a day to mind my own business. That was pretty to the point, wasn't it? Now, let's go a little further about Aunt Jenny in her later years. I've told you she was a medicine woman and a midwife. But one of the most interesting things to me is the fact that even way on up in her 80s, she gave her life to Christ. She donated the 2 acres of land where the current day Macedonia Baptist Church in the forest sits. Of course, that's a newer building now. But they said she would go to church and she would sit on the inside of the pew there to where she could reach out, and as the preacher come by, she'd take her cane and reach out and tap his leg, and that was supposed to be an indication that he was doing a good job and for him to preach on. But Aunt Jenny was known as a woman of character, of her word. So many stories are told today about how she done these bad deeds. But what most people don't want to hear are the ones that people told about how good she was. The ones that said there wasn't a better woman than Aunt Jenny. And how good she was to children, the neighbors. Most children knew if they had to walk by the Brooks family farm, or even I'm sure after she had married Johnston, if it was hot in the summertime, they always knew they could stop by Aunt Jenny's and have a cool drink of water from the well, and she might have them a snack. If it was cold outside in the wintertime, they always knew they could stop and warm up. It's also said Aunt Jenny loved to spin a tale. She loved children. She loved people. Obviously, I said if she didn't, why in the world would she be a midwife and a medicine woman? And so, as I said, even in her late years, way on up in her 80s, she gave her life to Christ. She was already so feeble, they said they took her down to the water in a rocking chair to baptize her. So that is a little bit about the legendary Aunt Jenny. Now I have brought some things up here along with these pictures. There are pictures here of actually the real Aunt Jenny, of when she was young and all the way up to probably when she was way up in her 90s here. But these are here. When we get done, you all are welcome to come by. Now, I have brought several things up here. I don't know how much time I have, Ms. D. Where are you?
Just talk away.
Okay.
2 hours.
2 hours. I have brought my basket, and I have brought some herbal extracts and tinctures and things up here that are significant of what I believe Aunt Jenny would have had. There are so many, and I know this, and I believe that Aunt Jenny would have had them because I also do Civil War history, and I know what herbs and things were used by our soldiers who, if any of you have ever studied Civil War history, you know that the South was poor. Because of the blockade by the Union forces, the South had to make do with what all they had and what they could scrounge up, what homes and families shared with them, and what they could gain from the wild. And I believe Aunt Jenny's native history, I believe she knew a lot of this, and she utilized a lot of this. So I bring a lot of things that that would have been used by her then. Obviously, and I can pass these around. Y'all can, most of you are going to know. You can have that. Oh, yeah. Most of you are going to know what that one is.
Sassafras.
Sassafras tea?
Probably sassafras, but I.
Sassafras. That's right. That is sassafras.
Sassafras tea.
Sassafras was known as a spring tonic, kind of like eating poke salad in the spring.
Wow.
Well, yes, it's a blood purifier.
Root beer. And
Smells good.
Sarsaparilla actually was.
Yeah, sassafras.
Yes, not sassafras.
Smell to them.
Yeah.
Maybe.
A neat little thing I like to tell about sassafras, though, that a lot of people don't know, is that the leaves, do y'all know what the leaves are good for?
Tea.
Tea?
I love her.
Well, yeah, you can use them for tea.
When I was finding it.
We know what.
We don't have any Cajuns or Creoles in here, do
Sassafras, it smells so good.
we? Any of you in the back know what else you use dried sassafras leaves for?
White powder.
Who said it? Did you say it? Ah, he's exactly right. Dried sassafras leaves are where filet powder comes from. That's a Cajun and Creole term that you know what filet powder is?
Yeah.
Well, that's
I'd
sassafras.
forgotten.
Dried sassafras leaves are filet powder. That's basically what it is. Ground up into a fine powder, and that is what would thicken stews and gumbos in the Cajun country. So yes, there's a lot of things, but now I'm going to tell you something else interesting. And I do believe that our soldiers and Aunt Jenny would have used this. Sassafras tea also kills head lice. Now, stop and think about that, folks. We know that people back then were plagued with several things due to the lack of a lot of conveniences that we have nowadays. So, if someone got lice, you couldn't run and buy a box of, what is it? Ridix, yeah. You couldn't go buy that stuff. So they had to come up, just like everything else, a homemade method. And sassafras tea is supposed to be one of those. So there you go. Now, whoop. I think we'll cook a little bit. Y'all can pass these around.
A strong one.
I've used it.
Yeah, there you go. Does anybody know what those are? I heard it.
Baby.
Sage.
Sage.
It's sage.
She said sage.
Sage. Mhm. Sage is another one of those things, most of us think of it as being good for what?
Pork.
Sausage and dressing.
Yes.
Well, let me just tell you, sage is good for many things besides that.
Did you have
And
some?
Where is she? Ah, she was here when I was here before, and she told me she's been using sage.
Yeah, I just had some sage today.
You had some sage today. Did you take it in capsule or did you drink it
I
in
take
tea?
it in capsule, and I've got a couple of plants outside. I'll twist them up and put them in the bowl and heat them, put some honey in it and drink it.
Do you like it?
Oh, yeah.
Do you drink it in the
It
morning?
makes dark hair, and it helps your skin,
Yes, ma'am.
and whatever.
Sage obviously is one of those things that is great for aging women, but it is also used as a tea. It's another reason I think even what they call the blessing sage, ceremonial sage, which is totally different than our sage. I think this is also a reason why the natives use this so much. It wasn't just known as a spiritual cleansing, it was a cleansing of the air and also for your respiratory. So sage tea, the culinary sage that I just passed out, actually made into a tea is very good for all this sinus stuff we all tend to get. And let me just tell you folks, if you haven't tried it, don't knock it because it doesn't taste like what it smells like or like when you put it in dressing and sausage. Does it?
And mullein also.
Oh, mullein is great.
Indian juice, same way.
Yes, they did.
Poultries, inhale it,
Amen.
I grow it.
Amen. And I think, nope, that's comfrey. I thought I had brought some mullein, but there's a small mullein leaf that I have in my basket. But yeah, mullein is fabulous, and I'm sure that would have been one of Aunt Jenny's top used herbs, along with plantain. But the sage, everybody always gets a kick out of it. So I have to tell you all, especially being as the age audience that most of us are, sage as a hair rinse made into a very strong tea and used as a hair rinse regularly was said to revert gray hair back to its color.
Oh, man, I'm a lost cause.
It also rubbed on topically and drank internally repeatedly. Now, folks, I'm not telling you overnight or even in 2 weeks or a month, but over a period of time was supposed to aid in baldness. Now, listen, I tell this story, and this is the truth. I had this friend, and she was doing sage tea because she had actually switched from her morning coffee to sage tea. Number one, it's not for her hair at all. That is not why she was doing it. It was because she was on up in her 50s, she was having some issues, and she said, you know, a lot of times as we get older, we would drink way too much coffee. I was having issues. I liked how the sage made me feel. It relaxed her. It is not one of those that you drink in the evening as a relaxant. It's hard to explain it because it's somewhat of a stimulant, but yet a nervine at the same time. And so it's kind of like a good replacement for coffee. And that's exactly what she'd done. She was drinking sage tea every morning. She also was going to have, she wears her hair short, and she was going to have her hair cut and trimmed every 2 weeks. And her beautician said, "What in the world are you doing? Are you putting Miracle Grow on your hair?" And she said, "No." She said, "I'm not doing anything any different." And then it hit her. She said, "Yes, I am." And she could not wait to tell me that. So, no, I've never heard of anybody rubbing it on the baldness. I've never heard of anybody doing it long enough to turn their gray hair back to its color. But make your hair grow and thicker? Yes. She has a head full of thick, thick hair. So, who knows? But there are some studies that show that that's what it was good for. And who knew? That's what goes in our sausage and our dressing. Now, the mullein, and I really meant to bring some bigger mullein leaves. Mullein grows all over our fields and pastures here in Alabama. And I brought this one because it's very young and I've dried it already. But those things can get huge and this wide. But yeah, like as long as your arm, you're right. But the natives would use those, they'd put it in their pipes, they'd just roll it up and smoke it. And it was good for all this respiratory stuff. It's an anti-inflammatory. But even to wrap around sprains, broken bones, those muscles and ligaments, when you have, when you have soreness, it works. And I can tell you stories from now till bedtime on that. I had a friend who had knee surgery, and her range of motion just was not where it needed to be. And so she came to stay with me for the week prior to my daughter getting married. And I told her, I said, well, I tell you what, if you want to try something, we'll do it every night between now and the wedding. Because she knew she was going to be on her feet a lot. And so I used big mullein leaves and dropped them down in boiling water and pulled them out and wrung them out. And one night I would wrap that around her knee and put a bandage on it, let her sleep in it. And then the next night I would put oil of mullein flower. By my daughter's wedding that weekend, she could go up and down the steps, to whereas when she first got there, it was that one step up, that one step. She was boop, 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 just like we were. And she was going with us all night long, loading all that stuff up, bringing it back home and unloading it. She's in her 70s. So it works. It's a great anti-inflammatory. Had a friend that her son had asthma, and as a little boy, he quickly learned when he had an asthma flare-up, she kept him mullein tea, just not hot. She just kept it in a quart jar in the refrigerator at all times, and he knew to just go and get just a little bit and drink it, and it would stop that kind of asthma attack that he could feel coming on. So, in this day and time that we're dealing with, from COVID all the way up to what we're dealing with the economy, the war in Ukraine, I have people asking me questions all the time, especially during COVID. All of the natural remedies, oh my goodness, herbalism exploded during COVID. And especially even now, so many people who've never gardened are saying, I want to plant a garden. People who have never known how to go out and gather anything natural are wanting to know how. And what do they say about all things old are new again? And I do believe, folks, that we ought to get back to some of the old ways, our natural ways, and stop depending on everything from somebody else. And so I have lots more things that I can show you and tell you about. Again, I don't know how much time you all have.
When you gonna have another herbal walk?
I am hoping,
Y'all need to go there.
turn that thing off. I'm going to do that one. And I'll
Okay,
Save
let's
it
get
for
it.
last, yes.
all right, any questions that you all have when we get done, I'm here, okay?
Can you buy that sage tea?
If they have it at the health food store,
You can buy it, but if you can also, if you grow sage, and sage is one of those you can actually grow in a flower pot.
mine's in a pot.
Do you have a home or do you live in an apartment?
I have a home and plenty of land.
Okay, then you could, and it's not the best option, but even the produce section you can buy. Again, it's so expensive to do it that way, but reach out to somebody that you know has some sage. Gosh,
I think
me
you
and
can-
my mama, we pick sage and dry it, and we have tons. So if you can't find some, you let me
I'll
know.
come to your house.
Yes, come see me. I'd love for you to come see me and get some sage. I would, serious. Yes, okay. So I'm going to tell you the story that she is referring to. Feel free to come up afterwards, ask me questions here, and I will be glad to try my best to answer. It has been so good to be here. I thank you all for having me. And if you decided down the road that you want to do actually a class on food preservation, some sustainability, straight up a whole herb class, you can let me know. And then, yes, I'd love for all of you to come see me for a herb walk. Absolutely. All right. As I said, Aunt Jenny was said to be part Cherokee. And people ask me all the time when I go out to Aunt Jenny's if I've ever seen her. I have not. And then I have those that say, well, what are you going to do if you do? I have never felt fear when I'm out there. It's a very peaceful place to me. But I have to tell you, I have had many, many people tell me hair-raising stories. I've had deacons. I've had ministers. Now, I've had law enforcement. Tell me some stories that really make you go, raise the hair on the back of your neck. What do you make of it? Well, what I say is that if you have Native heritage or you know anything about natives, they definitely had a belief and a faith in the spirit world, okay? So with that being said, I'm going to tell you the most popular story, the most known legend that's ever told about Aunt Jenny. And it dates back a long ways. Even as a little girl, on hay rides with our church and others, I heard this story. But it is said that if you're traveling along the old Bile Road, maybe on one of those moonlit nights, out in the distance you begin to see what appears to be a woman walking down the side of the road. Instantly your mind begins to race as to why this woman would be walking alone in the middle of that forest. If you've never traveled out there at night, you should. It's a very, very dark and lonely place. There's no street lights. Very, very few homes or residences out there. So why would this woman be walking alone? As your vehicle draws nearer, you realize this woman's on up in years. She has the long white hair. She has on what appears to be a long flowing nightgown. Your mind is racing. What on earth is this woman out here for? But it is said, as your vehicle draws alongside her, you realize she's not walking at all. It's as if she's just kind of floating through the air. And as your vehicle nears her, like the snap of your fingers, she enters the vehicle with you. Instantly, you feel that cold, cold chill from her presence. Now your mind's really spinning and racing. You're wondering, why is she here? Why me? What does she want? Does she think you're one of those from a long time ago? And maybe, just maybe, she still seeks vengeance on all of those. Or maybe she's just lonely and wants some company. But they say, if you dare, only if you dare, to turn and take a glance, as quick as she came, she's gone. That only leaves you wondering even more. Because where is she now? Where did she go? Will she be back? But they all say, those who have witnessed, if you take only a moment and have the patience and the willpower to just listen, you'll always have your answer. So just listen. As the stillness of the night in the forest returns, you hear the night sounds and the animals. Oh my God. That's the reason I backed up. Oh goodness. And then they say, Aunt Jenny has had her fun once again. Because as I said, they say Aunt Jenny loved to tell a tale and spin a yarn with the best of them. And every time I do that, I believe somewhere Aunt Jenny is having a good laugh.
Do you know CPR, man?
I do. I was actually certified at one time, so.
Everybody else.
Yeah, if I'd have been standing right here, it might have been different, wouldn't it? That's the reason I backed up. I've had young folks over at the Houston jail. The teachers would set them on the ground, and I would do my best to try to back up against my table as far as I could. And the teachers know it. They know it because they've seen me do it too many times, and me looking at them like, make this child back up. And I have had them just literally fall backwards and lay in the other one.
Well, I'm glad you were there.
Thank you all so, so much. I appreciate Listen, as a little girl, I tell people, I was a victim of these stories many times. Many pranks, many boo crews have been waiting in the forest and pulling pranks, and oh my goodness, my crew has done it more times than I can count. But one time I was on a hayride with our youth group from Ephesus Church, which actually sits right across from the Pebble Community Center. So they would ride from there out to the forest and go visit. They would send some men ahead, and there was like an old feed barn, or not a big barn, but like a little shack,
Crib.
a crib, some kind of log, old oak building. They would hide inside that, and they had rigged up a dummy on a rope and had it up hanging over the road bed. And as the trailer went under that, they dropped that thing down on the trailer with us. I remember today how that felt, because I felt like I could run back to the church. I wanted to just clear that trailer and run. And now, as my children began to grow up and we began to do y'all pardon me, I've got something in my eye. But we would do our annual events, and that is where I started doing Aunt Jenny. They asked could they do a hayride and invite some friends over, and I laugh today because now my children are 31 and almost 29, and I had told them they could each invite like 3, no more than 5 each. That went right out the water. Just right out the window like I never said it. And by the time they grew up and hit about 17, 18, to where I couldn't scare all of them anymore so well, they had all came almost every year, and they still will walk up to me and say, you need to do that again. You need to do that again. And I said, well, you all need to bring all your little ones, and we'll do it for the next generation. But it became an annual event, and by the time we quit doing that, we had to have 2 trailers, and the last time I had almost 100 people at my house. Aunt Jenny is the legend, not me. And so we've had a lot of good times, and I've met wonderful, wonderful people and some lifelong friends thanks to Aunt Jenny's history. But I felt if I was doing things at home and I was there, my children were there with me, so I knew what they were doing and not doing. And then I was asked to come and do Aunt Jenny at a Halloween party, and it just grew from there, and I've been doing Aunt Jenny's history ever since. And I wanted people to know who she really was, not just the jump out of your pants kind of stuff.
I still got them.
I had people that would walk in the library and say, I heard she chopped up children. Why? Why say that? There's no need to tell that kind of stuff. I heard she'd just go out and shoot people. No.
Without reason.
She had to survive.
She had to survive. She was a victim of her times, and it was all a matter of survival. And as I told at the dedication, and I said before, she was not the only person who had that kind of story, but she was ours. She's our legend. There's up in the mountains, up in the foothills, there's one about a lady named Granny Dollar, and her story is pretty phenomenal too. But all of you have stories. I know you do. I have stories.
Well,
obviously.
apparently they killed all of the men. They found all the
All
men
but
except
one.
for one.
All but one.
And
You're right.
he ran off,
She-
which I don't blame him. I would have run real
Are we
fast.
still running?
Did his
She
fingers
was,
still running?
she was quoted in an early 1920s paper stating they'd all been got but one. There are some pretty horrible stories because two of them that I can recount, but one of them, I mean, it was way on up, years later, and he was headed either to or from what they called the Bear Creek Mill, and some of the boys stepped out in front of him, told him to state his name, and he started saying, "Please don't kill me," because he knew exactly who they were. And they said, "I'm sorry, we have to."
They
Because he was-
tortured my husband and my son.
he was
I'd
one
shoot
of
them
them,
too.
and they had
Well,
swore that
you-
oath and allegiance, and
Yeah.
they were doing their dead level best to carry through for their mother, and by that point, it involved son-in-laws, grandsons. There was another one, and I won't call a name, but apparently they found him inside his barn, and eliminated him, and then went inside, caught his wife at the kitchen, and made her sit down and name names. So, you know, there again, a lot of people talk about that she was horrible, that she didn't have to do those things, and swearing out the vengeance, maybe not, maybe not. There were some things maybe could have been handled differently, yes. But don't we all make mistakes in the heat of the moment? Especially when it comes to our families. And I tell people I'm pretty peaceful, I think. But most of my family knows when it comes to my family, I can turn into something different.
Mama Bear's.
And I've said, and I know this camera's rolling, but I can't imagine that if I walked in and caught somebody doing something to one of my children, my grandchildren, my mother. My mother is my right arm. We've been a team all my life, and I'd take somebody out, you know? It's not that I would set out to just do that, it's, I know me. And I do that with a vengeance.